All right, welcome to everybody who's joining us. We appreciate you being patient until us letting everybody out of the waiting room right at 11 o'clock. We will get started in 30 more seconds, maybe a minute, just to give folks a chance to log on if they're running a little bit late. But I'm excited to see so many new faces on this webinar. My name is Claire Barnett. I guess I'll provide that information. And I work for the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation at Vanderbilt University. And so this is one of the events in our Autistic Pride Month series for the month of April. We are the only research center in the world at Vanderbilt here. So Vanderbilt's Research Center is the only one in the world focused on autism and employment. And a lot of times we partner with companies that are trying to create specific neurodiversity hiring or support programs. And too often they are just in tech, computer science, data analysis, and they're still great programs, but we want to expand the conversation. So that's the point of this event today. Another reason that we are such big fans of advocacy at the Frist Center is that more than half of our staff and some of our leadership are on the spectrum ourselves, including me. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Okay, it's 11:02. So let's officially kick this off. Welcome to everybody else. If anyone does end up joining late, I will let them in through the waiting room. I'll keep an eye on that. But you found yourself at the Frist Center's 4th Autistic Pride Month webinar, featuring our first speaker, Haley Moss, who you may have heard of. If you haven't, you'll get to hear from her today about her experiences. And then we have got a Vanderbilt professor in psychology and a Vanderbilt MD PhD. So that's like med school with a PhD on the side. So no big deal. Candidate. And both of these individuals are also self-advocates. So hopefully this is going to be a really exciting conversation where we get to combine several fantastic perspectives of people who chose not to take the sort of traditional or predetermined path of, well, if you're autistic, I guess you better like learn to code. And as someone who is autistic and works in communications at the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation, this is a topic that's really important to me. And I think a lot of times it can also be women who end up saying, yes, I'm on the spectrum. And also I have an affinity for communication, for psychology, for visual thinking, graphic design, journalism. And so while it doesn't fall strictly across gender lines, this is also something that's important to me because we see a higher percentage of autistic women who don't feel comfortable going straight into tech. Anyway, having set that up, I want to allow our speakers to take the floor. And so I typically moderate these webinars. If this is your first one coming to that the Frist Center has hosted, we have one every month and April has 6 because Autistic Pride Month. But there will be 2 more this month along with one every future month. So you'll see my face if you join those. You can always go to the Frist Center website or Instagram should that sound of interest to you. But today, let's allow Haley to introduce herself. And Haley's going to talk to us about her own sort of journey of picking the field she was interested in and pursuing it, despite having been diagnosed at a younger age, knowing, you know, the stereotypes that were out there about autistic people being suited for, you know, one type of work if they were going to have a job at all. And we know that approximately 80% of autistic adults are un or underemployed, which is ridiculous. And a lot of times it makes other people say, you know, any job's a good job, just take it. But we deserve better than that. Our panelists deserve better than that. They deserve the opportunity to pursue whatever their talents and interests lie in. So I will yield the floor for you to introduce yourself, Haley, and you are welcome to take off with your story. Or if you'd like, you can pause and I'll sort of guide the conversation with prompting questions, whatever you're most comfortable with.
Ooh, questions are always fun, but I will get us started. Thank you all again for joining us on this lovely morning, afternoon. So I am from Florida. I'm an hour ahead of everyone. So it is lunchtime here in sunny Miami. And I think the really cool thing when we have these conversations is that we are really breaking stereotypes. So that tech genius stereotype has existed in autism for a very long time. I was diagnosed in the late 90s. I found out myself when my parents sat me down when I was about 9 years old. So I've always kind of had this understanding of autism. But on top of these tech stereotypes, a lot of the stereotypes that I knew and that my parents knew when I was growing up also stem from what appeared to be largely unskilled or no education required type labor as well. So when I was first diagnosed, my parents were literally told that to have expectations for me to work in a fast food restaurant. And I'm not one to say that's not honorable work. And I have infinite amounts of respect for our essential workers who are working in grocery stores, restaurants, whether they're fast food or fine dining, whatever it may be. But we shouldn't be setting that as the limit, as that's where the sky is and ends. So that was the other side of the stereotype that we experienced, because back then it was all about quote unquote functioning labels and what you would be able to do. And also this very doom and gloom version of autism that was effectively scaring parents. But I think growing up as well, I did have a family that really encouraged me to pursue whatever I wanted. I was really involved in the arts growing up, actually. So I started doing drama. I was very creative. I was always someone who also did a lot of drawing and painting forever. And I thought that for a very brief time that I was going to be a professional painter. And that probably lasted a hot second, because I realized that is not the easiest thing to get into. And I thought the idea of going to art school was very intimidating. I have a lot of friends who are neurodivergent and did go to art school and absolutely loved it. But the whole subjectiveness of it and not knowing where that concrete, this is how you may be graded thing would work, kind of freaked me out. And that's why I didn't apply to art school. So I decided on what I was going to be doing. I thought in high school, when I was in high school, I thought the greatest thing in the world would be to be an autistic psychiatrist. I loved AP Psych. I didn't understand how people operated. It was all this big guessing game. And I thought, what better way to be able to help people than to understand the intricacies of the human brain, to understand how people operate and work, how all of this comes together. I thought it would just be so interesting, such a great way to make a difference, maybe get to take a different approach, refer people out, all sorts of cool stuff. Fast forward another year or two, we get to college, and I realized that as much as I thought that was going to be my career path, and as much as autistic people are so-called very gifted in science and things like that, I lasted 6 weeks in general chemistry before realizing this was extremely not for me. Capital N, capital F, capital M, not for me. And I had that realization and thought, well, I'm not going to be a psychiatrist. I am not going to go to med school. So more power to anyone who does. I know one of our panelists is in med school, and I envy you that you have the ability to do that, that you have absolutely crushed it to get that far. It was not for me, and I wished that it was at the time. So I had to go back to the drawing board and think about what my strengths actually were. I was not a programmer. I was not a science person. And of course, that's the messaging that goes around autism. I loved to write and I loved to talk. And I realized that I enjoyed helping other people. So that is how I decided on going to law school and becoming a lawyer, whatever that meant. So I wasn't one of those people who thought they were going to be a lawyer forever, because lawyers, or the future lawyers that I knew growing up, were people who were very talkative, always into debate, always doing these different things that I wasn't doing. I was not a debater. I was very shy in school. I didn't speak up in class a lot. I didn't join all of these different social activities. And I perceived lawyers as being this very talkative, very argumentative group. And meanwhile, I was scared to have confrontation because I thought that meant I would be socially unaccepted, even more so than I already could be as an autistic person who struggles with social interactions to begin with. So when we put this all together, it seems like the law is the place that autistic people don't belong, but it couldn't be further from the truth. So the cool thing about law is it's really fun because you could easily, and you get upset when you realize people are lying and they're not really supposed to lie. There's a lot of hard and fast rules with court procedure, with how to file things. There's a lot of very didactic parts. And actually, I had a conversation recently with a law professor who told me that law is kind of the software of society. And when he phrased it that way, it made me think back on all these stereotypes. And he was like, of course, there's people on the spectrum in law. It is the software of society. And I couldn't stop thinking about that. So I know that we can also be here all day talking about the many intricacies of grad school and law school and how that kind of shakes out and how those systems can be extremely difficult to navigate, I think, for autistic people, and even more so if you're multiply disabled or multiply marginalized as well. But I do think that as a career path, I think it's something that's been really fun for me. I really enjoy the policy aspect more so than actual practice, but to each their own. I just think policy is really exciting. I love seeing how different areas of law intersect with our lives. I love seeing how we can improve upon that, because I think the other thing that I thought about law as well is I thought I was going to just be a disability attorney. I thought, because that was kind of the other prescribed path, is that we have this idea, especially for autistic people, when they get into these other fields, that all they're going to do surrounds autism and related disabilities. And the thing with disability laws, as much as that I truly, genuinely love the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the three major pieces of legislation that kind of are the bedrock of disability law, is that when I represented people with disabilities, I worked in a nonprofit legal organization that worked with disabled clients, is I got too empathetic. I thought too much about my clients. I couldn't separate the personal from the professional whatsoever. One of my first clients was a woman with epilepsy. And I would go home every single night worried about her, hoping she didn't have a seizure that she struggled with or couldn't get out of or had to be hospitalized. I'd be thinking about her every single night. And it made it almost impossible for me to do that work and separate that. And a lot of people in law are able to very much separate their clients from their daily lives. I couldn't, because this young woman was maybe 3 or 4 years older than me. And I couldn't stop thinking that if in a different world, in a different universe, her situation that she was in legally could have easily been me. So that is why I did not go into disability law. It was too hard as an empathy thing, is I had empathy overload from it. And that's why my first job, I actually worked in a more corporate area of law. I represented hospitals against insurance companies. Hospitals don't have feelings the way that a 20-something woman with epilepsy does. A hospital is out there just to get their money from the insurance company. They perform the services, they want their money. It was a lot easier to have that balance for me. And I still also got to do some cool things like try to recognize patterns, irregularities, try to lay down the book with the rules. I thought it was very interesting, but I also realized that I enjoyed helping people more than that, which is why I eventually went on my own and did neurodiversity consulting and actually want to make law firms and our profession a more equitable place for lawyers with disabilities and neurodivergent lawyers in particular, since the law has a really big onus on mental health and they love to talk about mental health and wellness. They're not very good at actually supporting attorneys who are neurodivergent or who have mental health disabilities. And their idea of diversity often does not include disability whatsoever. They just lump us in as a mental health and wellness problem, that we're just all inherently unhealthy. So that has been my work, is trying to make lawyers actually behave better, which means we will have a more exciting profession going forward too. It's kind of the executive summary, because the thing that we learn in law school is not to be super flowery writers, that why say it in like 7 if you could say it in 4 words. So I'm trying to do that when I talk now too, because I can say the same thing and go on for an hour, but why spend an hour saying something that can be said in 10 minutes?
Well, and I love that that allows us to have plenty of time for our conversation and connection between our panelists. And I think the best way to follow up your introduction, Haley, is to have Zack and Suzana, our other 2 autistic panelists who've joined us today, fill in a little bit of their professional experience and path and, diagnosed early or late. And then I have a few questions for each of you that are going to dig into those experiences. And then after that, if our audience has questions, I would love for you to put those in the chat, or if you prefer to ask it out loud, you are welcome to wave your hand around, unmute, we'll call on you to ask that question. Before I transition over to our panelists introducing each other, I just wanted to, because I'll forget to mention this if I don't now, say that Haley has written a couple of news articles that have gained traction and been really interesting, and they're excellent reads. So I would advise you to Google her name and look for those news articles. There was a particular HuffPost piece that originally I was like, oh wait, I want to know this person, but there have been a couple others she's pinned as well. So be sure to do that if you haven't yet. But let's let our other 2 panelists join this conversation. And why don't we start with Zack, because you show up first on my screen, Zack, so you win.
All right. Great. Hello, everyone. So my name is Zack Williams. I am now a fourth year MD PhD candidate here at Vanderbilt. I am getting my PhD in neuroscience and hearing and speech sciences together. I did my undergrad at Yale, and I am originally from Santa Barbara, California. I was diagnosed with what was then Asperger's syndrome in 1999 when I was 4 years old. And I think I first learned I was autistic when I was teen or preteen, and was when my mother told me. And so I've had a long time that I've known I was autistic, and it's been a part of my identity. And I think I didn't always um, do autism related things, but that's really where I've ended up. I am in fact an autism researcher. I do autism research, neuroscience research, and my goal is to work in a clinical field that is specifically catering to the mental health needs of autistic adults, which is very much an underserved population in adult psychiatry. So that's kind of where I'm going. And as far as like my path to get there, I have sort of I decided pretty early on, probably in high school, that I wanted to do medicine, just because it was sort of the natural thing for a person who is good at science and math to want to do. It's a career you know about. But then when I spent some time in undergrad, I think I became more and more interested in psychology, much like Haley did. It was fascinating to me to understand how other people worked and how the brain worked, and how I could figure out the neural basis of mental illnesses and other behavioral conditions. And so because of that, I started spending some time doing psychology research, and eventually made my way over to the Yale Child Study Center, where I did first encountered autism research. My personal connection to the field made me really interested in it, and I think that kind of everyone really enjoyed my enthusiasm. I worked hard. I learned a lot, and I sort of soaked up all of the information I could. And so in a couple of years, I was pretty set on pursuing a career in autism research, and I've really never looked back. So here I am doing my dissertation in autism research, and I expect to fully go on and make it my life's work. So we'll see.
Thank you, Zack. And I would like to point out to our listeners and anyone who listens to this after the fact on YouTube, at first glance, you're going, well, he's in STEM. This is medicine. This is science. But I wanted to bring Zack into this conversation, and to some degree, Suzana as well, because there's this misconception that there's like this very specific narrow path where an autistic person might possibly succeed, and it never involves leadership or advanced degrees. It's just that their brain can be good at coding and tech. Sometimes some sort of engineering research. So the fact that Zack is specifically pursuing medicine, that has, he's getting an MD PhD, which is, as Haley mentioned, is something I can't even wrap my head around. It's, in some ways it's leadership. In other ways, it's breaking out of, like, you're staying within your areas of skill and interest, of saying, no, I like research, like I like science, I like math, but you're not being pigeonholed into, okay, so I guess I'll work with computers, people are a failure, because that's not necessarily true. So anyway, thank you, Zack. And Suzana, if you'd like to jump in and explain to us, how did you end up in academia? Because you don't only research, but you'll work alongside students. And so that again is a place where you're like coming up alongside people. And the assumption is that autistic people can't succeed in careers with people. So anyway, tell us about your path and where you've ended up.
Right, and in my case, my story here is different in terms of when I became aware of what was going on, and that was certainly transformative. I knew I was weird. I only got diagnosed 2 years ago, and it's really interesting to hear both Haley and Zack talk about this interest in understanding how people work, because well before I got diagnosed at age 45, it was very clear to me that other people, I did not work like I work. I certainly do not function like other people function. And learning to deal with that is a lifelong effort, and learning to deal with students, to handle just all sorts of social interactions, which of course you learn when you're on the spectrum. I think you learn very quickly that small groups are where we thrive just a couple of people, or if it's bigger groups, if I'm the one doing a presentation, then that's perfectly fine. But don't throw me in a bunch of 10 people and expect me to function, because I'm going to be trying very hard to just focus on what the hell exactly is going on. And when people say this, do they really mean that, or do they mean something else? So the part about interacting with students is something that you have to learn, but it's facilitated by the one-on-one side of working in a lab. When I train my students, when I work together with my students, it's just the two of us, or at most I have two students working with me, and then it's a completely different scenario. Also, I grew up in Brazil, and there you have the cultural aspect of relationships, interactions between students and professors tend to be, well, I'm from Rio, and in Rio they tend to be much more relaxed. You go to another city and then things are much more formal, so there's that difference too. So something that I've been doing in the 2 years since I've been diagnosed is look back and make sense of how things worked, and what were the things, like what were some of the advices that I had from people who didn't actually know that I was on the spectrum, because I myself didn't know, my parents didn't know. But you don't depend on a diagnosis to understand what are the difficulties that somebody has, right? And I remember it was a professor in college who turned to me and said, look, you need to let people explain things to you. It doesn't matter how much you already know. Don't try to speed up the conversation. Just deep breaths, listen to them. It doesn't matter if you already know everything that they're telling you. This is one of those rules of engagement. You let them talk, and then you give your piece. And I work in science communication as well, which could be a very weird thing for somebody who's on the spectrum. But I like to think now that's exactly because interacting with other people requires so much effort to me, that even though it's not automatic to infer what are other people's intentions, or what people actually mean when they say whatever it is that they say, I have been forced to train myself to always think of what might be on other people's minds, and which happens to be a very basic prerequisite for effective science communication. You have to anticipate what people don't know and what people know already, so that you can actually convey what you want to say. So that certainly it was a learning experience, a learning curve, and it continues to be a learning curve. But I just wanted to add that, of course, there's the part where you realize that you do have what I've learned to call superpowers. And those absolutely come in fantastically handy. In my case, my superpower is looking at graphs and numbers and finding patterns in things that other people look at and nothing occurs to them, nothing springs to their eyes, and I'll just look at those graphs and say, it's right here, you see, it's right there, and how can you not see it? So a large part of that self-training is also, along with the let people explain things to you, is also the understand that not everything makes the same sense to you as to other people as it does to you, which is to me I've come to enjoy as one of the really cool things about diversity, which happens to also be my main research interest. It's I go by the motto, whatever works. That's what I found in my work. There's not this one way to put brains together. There's brains are also not optimized, they're not ideal, and they don't have to be. And that's the beautiful thing, because then that's exactly how you get the possibility of having different people with different strengths, which of course will come with different difficulties also, assembled in the room trying to achieve something together. So,
well, and Susanna, what I hear you saying there, it like comes together very well with what our other two panelists have said. This idea that it's not that there's this one structure and there's one little block where autistic people or autistic minds fit and that's it, but the idea that different minds in all spaces are exactly what we need.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's the huge benefit of having diversity. And the thing is that this is a whole other argument. I'll be happy to get in later, but the thing is, diversity does not come from competition and selection. Diversity is something that happens naturally simply because life is never perfect. It's never 100% efficient or efficacious. So diversity simply, variation simply happens. And it's on us to learn to handle that and actually do the best that we can with that diversity that we have. So I don't like to think in terms of, frankly, I don't even like to think in terms of disability. I am perfectly aware that there are, if autism and Asperger's turn out to really be one huge spectrum, then you definitely have people who are on the extreme of difficulties of functioning in society, which is how most of us define normal, right? But you start looking at biology, that perfect definition of normal, the person who is normal in every single sense, that does not exist, simply because diversity is so wide. Anyway, that's a whole other topic, sorry.
Right. Well, and it's Susanna, I'm hearing so many ideas, like we should have this webinar and this webinar. So we may reach back out to you in the future to dig a little deeper into these. We already have several great questions in the chat though. And there was even a hand raised at one point. And so that's something, I think it was JJ, we'll circle back around to you in just a moment. But first I want to do a speed round of questions for my three panelists. So it's sort of like in 30 seconds, if you had to answer this with the first thing that comes to mind, what is your initial thought in response to this question? And so the first one is, did at any point, based either on your diagnosis or simply the things that other people knew about your strengths and weaknesses, which you could now say fit the pattern of autism, did people pressure you to pursue some field other than the one that you wanted to pursue? Did you ever feel pigeonholed into work that didn't involve people or work that really was more, you know, tech focused, because that's what autistic people do? Like, did you encounter that from a peer, a teacher, possibly a parent or family member? And let's circle back around our little loop. So Haley, what is your initial thought to that? Did you experience that at any point?
I didn't experience it at home. I didn't experience it at school. I did experience it in my very first legal job, actually. Is while I was absolutely hired as an attorney, I was always assigned very tech-based tasks, and the other associates wouldn't be, at least not to the extent that I was. And I couldn't help but wonder if that came to the autistic people are very good at computers types stereotypes. And I felt like on top of being an attorney, I had to live up to being able to really effectively run our firm website, that I had to be really good at these discovery tasks that involved going through thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lines of data in Excel to kind of find inconsistencies in statements and invoices and all sorts of different things. And I really just couldn't help but wonder if that was an autism thing or it was this is how you're going to cut your teeth as a new person thing. But I do think getting some of those extra tech tests were definitely you were autistic and therefore you were good at computers. So I did feel that
and
way.
it may be that thing that happens when someone else thinks they know how to help you without actually asking you, what are your needs? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? So anyway, that too, whole nother webinar. But let's jump to Zach. Did you face at any point people urging you to pursue a different path?
I wouldn't say urging, though. I mean, I always have shown aptitude in math and technology and computers. So I think at the same time, it's like, hey, Zach, you're good at this. Like, do you want to do this? And to some extent, I do. I mean, much of my job is like coding and data analysis and spreadsheets and things, and I love it. I mean, I am really an applied data scientist at my core, and that's fine. At the same time, I do think people have been generally really supportive about me going into psychology or things that don't seem like they're typically autistic things. And certainly my mother was a little taken aback at first, but I don't think at any point she was like, oh, you can't do that. It was just like, oh, that's interesting, okay, well, good for you, keep on it.
And have you
I think
found
that's the right
people
attitude to
that
have.
have you found anyone who was just really surprised? Like, I thought Zach was on the spectrum. What do you mean he went to Yale or he's going to Vanderbilt's medical school? Has that come up at any point?
Not really. I don't know. I think that it's usually the other way around. It's like, oh yeah, Zach comes off as a person who went to Yale. I didn't know he was on the spectrum.
Okay, so something about them knowing first your interest, where you ended up, and then finding out maybe later that you're autistic is like, well, okay, I can put that information together. Um, okay, cool. Suzana, what do you think? Did anyone along the way encourage you to do anything that didn't involve working with students, or maybe instead of psychology they were like, well, you should really pursue physics, or was there any sort of push to do things that really suited more of the often less socially strong skills that autistic adults have?
If it was veiled, and I was the one who was absolutely clear on not going into, let's say, people-centered jobs. But it was not really not really in a negative way. It was more in always in terms of I like I like asking questions. I like getting to the bottom of things. And I suck at interacting with lots of people around me. So I know very well where I should be headed. But
Well,
again, I remember I only got diagnosed 2 years ago.
exactly. And that makes your experience really different. But I will say, without having some adeptness at interacting both with your students and your superiors, you wouldn't have made it as a Vanderbilt instructor, professor. So there's something there that you, I think, have some skill, whether it's developed in or just naturally that you enjoy trying to figure out how to communicate with people.
Absolutely. So that's the thing, and that's something that I'm learning to deal with now, because people will hear that I'm on the spectrum and say, but you look so normal, you're not autistic. And I'm like, thank you, I guess, although you don't realize how insulting what you're saying really is. But it only goes to show how much effort it goes into learning to relate to other people and to function in a way that other people can actually deal with. So it takes a lot of effort on our part, much more than, and this is something that ends up being imbalanced too. And that's where the advocacy work comes in. Just reminding people out there that, look, the effort shouldn't be entirely on our part. If people only acknowledge that there's a lot of variation, there's a lot of diversity out there, and it's perfectly fine if not everybody functions the same way that you do.
Absolutely. Well, and what's interesting is in y'all's responses, you've really sort of addressed the second sort of speed round question I was going to bring up. So we'll actually shift over to our panel discussions. And I'm excited to do this because I see a lot of really interesting points and inquiries in the panel. We've got a couple here that have been messaged to everybody that I'll read out, and another that was privately messaged to me that I'll read. And so we're going to shift into more like conversation mode here, which is pretty exciting. What it means is, ideally, our panelists are going to interact with each other on these concepts and to offer advice to all of you guys who are listening in. And the very first conversation that started in the chat here is with a comment from Anthony, who says, I work with a variety of students, and I find the, quote, can't mentality is really embedded. So students saying, I can't do this because I have this condition, or I was told I can't do much because of my challenges. What's a good response when he is consistently hearing this language from students? And I'd like to point out that after some input from Nina, who's another self-advocate, who's a part of our Vanderbilt self-advocacy group, she says, I think in a lot of cases, these thoughts are implanted by others. They've heard so often they cannot. Lower your expectations. And she suggests connect them with role models who have succeeded. So, tell them about people like these three who are saying, no, look what I can do. And then Anthony brings up the comment, and this is where we'll sort of shift over to our panel, that he sometimes tells his students to take the dis out of disability and to focus on ability. And I would like to bring into the conversation that this is something that disability advocates often would push back against, because what's really interesting about disability or autism as an identity is that it's something that simultaneously involves both the challenges and the strengths. And so the idea of empowering your students by having them take a strengths-based focus and looking at what they can do is perfect. But to ignore the dis and the disability ends up leaving them often without needed support, or feeling like they should be able to do things that biologically their brains are not wired to do. And it's kind of like conversations where people say, I just don't see color, and they're talking about race. If you ignore the part that often causes the more challenging experience in society, you're not appreciating that person's full lived experience or supporting them the best you can. So that's my soapbox. I'll hop off of it, but I would love for this conversation to continue with any of our panelists who have thoughts on the matter. And I see, like, Haley, you unmuted. Is there something you want to add to this line of questions?
You kind of nailed it on the head. I want to echo what you said, especially about kind of ignoring the disability part of autism. So I think that's the interesting thing, is autism is both disability and difference, even when we look at it through a neurodiversity and acceptance lens, is that it's hard to see it in just one way. So it's, especially with young kids know what they're good at, kids know what they're bad at. They know that they're struggling with things. So I did get one of those superpowers explanations of autism when I was growing up, because it was appropriate for me at age 9. I knew I was terrible at making friends. I knew what was hard for me. We didn't have to beat a dead horse talking about it. So we focused on the strengths, because so often autistic kids don't get that. But I think that ignoring the fact that things are very difficult, or saying don't see that, does send a message, like you're saying, is that you have to be able to do it. You have to have this understanding, and you don't get the support you need. And I think even growing up with the diagnosis that had the words high functioning in it, that I often wouldn't get all the support I needed, or I thought that I wasn't deserving of support. So I think we have to have people know what the whole picture, the good and the bad, and the things that are hard, the strengths, the weaknesses, so then they could get support in the areas that they need it most, and also just be able to celebrate the things that they're really, really good at. So kind of echoing what you said, but just understanding that it does look different at different ages and stages.
Well, and I love the idea that for Anthony's students, and it might depend on what developmental stage they're in, because I don't know how old these students are, but it's likely, like you point out, that they are very aware of what they're not great at. And it's not that you have to pretend those things don't exist, but that you can complement it with, and these are your strengths and abilities, and these are other people who have leveraged similar strengths and abilities. So Zack, Suzana, do either of you guys have advice for Anthony or something you want to contribute to the conversation?
Yeah, I do. I'd like to add to that. So every single person has strengths and weaknesses. What is particular to people who are on the autism spectrum is that there is a pattern to what usually are the strengths and what usually are the weaknesses. And sometimes that pattern of weaknesses is strong enough that you really have difficulties performing in some contents, like socially. But so yes, you can call that a disability, but the key point, the real importance of doing that is acknowledging that these are things that no matter how hard I try, my brain just doesn't process them the same way as other people's do. So I'm not going to live my life focused on that every single day, but I need to be aware that that exists. So it's self-awareness. To me, it's about self-awareness. It's not about focusing on the disability and making your life about that, or framing what you do or try to do or don't do in terms of your disability, but rather in terms of what you can do.
Well, that's what we do with all kids, right? Is say, okay, let's focus on your strengths and pursue them, like autistic or not.
Exactly.
That's like a best practice.
Exactly, but without ignoring what your disabilities or your difficulties are. That's actually a part of what makes you stronger, is becoming aware, becoming self-aware of what do you not do well.
Yeah. Well, and I think Anthony would like to jump into this conversation. So if there's something that you would like to clarify, add, your own perspective on your experience with your students, whatever it is you wanted to say, please jump in and let us know.
Yeah, so hi everybody, I'm Anthony. I work at TRC in Smyrna in Tennessee. And the range is from about 19 to about 27 years old. And just to clarify, I don't not have the part of the disability in there, but when I first say, tell me about yourself, I'm finding the embedded information is not even saying their name. They'll say, this is the disability I have. So that's what I was trying to get across, is like, identify yourself as your name and the person that you are. Of course, I agree with everybody here, and Suzana kind of really exactly what I was trying to say there too. But not making it everything about their disability, but of course including it. So in no way was I saying that. I was saying more of, that is just not your identity.
Absolutely. And I appreciate
Thank
that
you.
clarification, Anthony. It sounds like you really care about these young adults you're working with. I'm glad you're here to listen to some self-advocates today, but I think the perspective you're taking on it sounds to me like a really healthy one. And I'm glad that you want to help your students focus not just on that weakness as their primary identity. And you know what it brings into the conversation that we haven't addressed yet is language. Person first and identity first language. And so you guys have probably noticed that I'm using a lot of identity first language, saying autistic, and that's something that a lot of our panelists also have echoed. And I think it's because, kind of like saying you don't look autistic is an insult. To refuse to say autistic is to imply that being associated with autism is a bad thing. So that's why it's sort of a reclaiming of using identity first language, or to say, oh, well, if you tell me I don't look autistic, you're implying that it would be better if I'm not. So anyway, that's what you're noticing as we use identity first. But a lot of times the argument for person first is like, you don't have to just identify yourself by that diagnosis. And so I end up oftentimes using both, and every person on the spectrum gets to choose which they prefer. But if you're someone who's been surprised at all by the use of identity first language, I figured this is a good point to explain that. But okay, thank you, Anthony. We are going to, unless Zach, did you have anything else you wanted to add before we shift to the next question?
No, that's all right. We can keep going.
All right, perfect. I would love to ask the question that I was privately messaged in the group. So we're going to keep this one anonymous, but still a great question. And I think our panelists are going to have a lot to offer on this. So this person says, I'm an autistic PhD student in a research lab focused on autism. I'm wondering how you decide whether to disclose your diagnosis or not, especially in academia. I don't want it to be a disadvantage for me in the job search in the future. So, a few years from now. And research shows that sometimes disclosing can end up being a disadvantage. And so don't want to just do what society wants to make people happy. So this person's trying to figure out, do I explicitly disclose this? And if so, when and how? Or do I not? Do I keep it to myself if I'm someone who can sort of mask my symptoms well enough? So having been through grad school to get where you are, I know you've all had experiences in academia to some degree, but why don't we start with Zach on this one? Because I think you are also in a research lab focused on autism. You're also currently a PhD student. I mean, what would you say to this person?
Sure. And so I think that it is a good place to be as an autistic researcher, to be in autism research, because I would say that on the whole, the entire field is getting more and more accepting of autistic researchers as a part of the research ecosystem, and it is less and less stigmatized to disclose your diagnosis. Now, I've always been very open about my autism. It was in fact in my personal statement, so I'm pretty sure everyone knew from the moment I walked in. And that's fine. I mean, certainly plenty of people are not comfortable doing that, but I am. And I think that for the most part, it really hasn't held me back in any meaningful way. And I really think it's actually opened doors in certain places. Like, for instance, I sit on the International Society of Autism Research's like Autistic Researchers Committee, which is a newly formed board of autistic researchers who are hoping to make INSAR, the organization, more autistic friendly. And I think that by being open about my identity in this group, it encourages other people to feel that they can come forward and be openly autistic in this organization. Now, I do think that, on the academic job search, there are certainly ways that, that could harm you in the long run. People may question your ability to, teach a certain kind of course or interact with colleagues. But at the same time, I think if you are aware of that, you can counteract it. I mean, you can probably let the scholarship that you produce stand on its own for the first thing. But second of all, I mean, if you realize that there are going to be certain interpersonal weaknesses that others think, just because you say autism, what you can do is make your recommendations specifically speak to those qualities. And obviously, discrimination based on your autism alone is illegal and will never actually come up in a, formal sense. But, to say that it doesn't influence people's decisions is false.
Well, and I would add to that if you're trying to integrate yourself into a new job where they immediately see that as something that's to your detriment, I kind of wonder, like, what kind of autism research lab is that? Do you want to be a part of that? And that's my first, like, personal thought approaching the matter. And so, and that's something you have to ask yourself. Is maybe disclosing sort of a filter for, like, this would be a welcoming environment for me and for, like, the way they approach autism in their research versus, maybe it's just that that's too personal, that you'd rather keep your personal life private and it's not even about that at all. So I don't know. Haley or Susanna,
sorry, one more brief thing is, just to say that in autism research, also personal connections to autism are not uncommon. I would say that, a very disproportionate amount of autism researchers have a family member on the spectrum. And, many have, subclinical autistic traits, even if they are not autistic. And I think that sort of does shine through. Those people especially will sort of see you as an asset rather than, your autism being a detriment. So you could look out for, that kind of connection to autism. Like my current PI has an autistic son. And I think that has helped her understand autism, more personally while also being a good researcher.
Absolutely.
But can I jump in? Yeah, but that's a particular case where your coworkers are educated already on at least in the topic. They're aware that there's people on the spectrum come in a whole range. It's well beyond the simple stereotype that maybe most people out there still have in mind. So yes, that's not negating what you just said. It's just that for most people out there, their work experience is not working in a lab that studies autism. And then I completely understand that it becomes a much more immediate, urgent question of, do I disclose this? Do I not? So to be clear, it's not public knowledge that I'm on the spectrum, but it's also not a secret. I will tell, for now, I've been telling the people closest to me, also at work, because that's important to me. I know that part of my difficulties is relating to people or talking to people in a way that I don't come across as rude or too forward or insensitive. And disclosing that is very helpful in that sense, that people can help me by simply saying, you really shouldn't say it that way, or
Well, and that's an excellent point, that if you need any kind of accommodation or understanding, then the disclosure can be what allows that. So
Exactly.
anyway, I want to let Haley comment on this, because then we have at least two other, and quicker, not quite as like nuanced questions, but two other questions I would love for us to get to in the next 10 minutes. But go ahead, Haley.
So I kind of wanted to build on something that Zach mentioned about discrimination. So if you are actually pursuing accommodations, whether it's through formal disability services or even more informally, sometimes you actually do have to disclose and to even get that reasonable accommodations process started, especially if you're going through like an on-campus disability center or something like that. Even with jobs that if they are bound under the ADA, the legal answer of when to disclose is when you need an accommodation. So anything else is a completely personal decision, that disclosures can be the thing that kicks off that process. So I wanted to add that in. As for me, when I was in academic settings, at least when I was in school, I mainly disclosed on the need to know basis. Even though I was openly autistic, people didn't know what that always meant. And that I was pretty open, like it wasn't really a secret. It wasn't something I was trying to hide, but I wouldn't have an extended conversation unless I was seeking accommodations or it was someone that I worked with frequently enough that they needed to know, just so they wouldn't think that I was being unprofessional or I was being rude, or that they can help support me and that I could best support them. So I did work with professors on different projects. So law school's not really as research-based. I did law review, which is research that's more independent. So we didn't get to do studies or anything super cool. But I did do one of those workshops that we presented continuing legal education to members of the legal community. And we were supervised by a professor, and having worked for her for 2 years, of course I had to disclose, because I wanted her to know how I worked best and that I wasn't blowing something off if there wasn't a firm deadline. Just little things like that was what was important to disclosure. But I think that there are, especially in certain disciplines, a lot more barriers to access with that disclosure. So law is a very much, I think, competitive field that the wrong person will see it as a huge detriment and weakness without knowing anything. The most accepting people I've worked with, so kind of going back to what Zach said earlier too, are people that have a dog in this fight, a stake in the game, like people that are parents of autistic kids or parents of kids with disabilities, that those have always been the best supervisors that I had, and by far the most supportive. That their education might not have been on the same level, but having that connection at least made it a more welcoming environment for me at times.
Absolutely. Y'all have said so many great things. They're like thoughts that have crossed my mind, and I'm like, I'm going to say that if I get a chance. And then one of y'all says it. I'm like, oh, great, it's taken care of. But I want to add in here, my face is not on the event poster, right? But I think I have something to offer here, that as soon as I was diagnosed at age 19, so I was an undergrad at Vanderbilt, I immediately was like, okay, so we're going to be out of the closet with this. Like, it was sort of a no-brainer for me that I didn't want it to be something I hid. So like, if you Google Claire Barnett, you're going to find like articles I wrote and, talks I've given. And the first thing you click on is going to say like Claire, autistic. And that's a decision I made largely also based on the fact that I was already mostly through my education, because I think the educational setting can be one where it's really challenging to have that attached, especially because kids are cruel. But as a young adult receiving that diagnosis, I was like, I don't want this to have stigma, and I'm going to act like it's a great thing I'm proud of. Anyone who has a problem with that can, take it up with me. But that's also a great transition to the next question that was put in the chat from Dan, which says, has autism made you better at public speaking? And it's interesting because I think the four of us sitting here who are speaking publicly are all pretty good at it. And Dan says he enjoyed Suzana's TED Talk on the human brain. And that's what made this a segue in my mind, because I have also given a Vanderbilt TEDx talk about autistic employment. And I remember saying, like, I think one of the reasons I'm able to really structure a 10-minute speech to be efficient and impactful is because the autistic logical brain is like, here's exactly what I need to say and how. There must be a transition. That's the rules of good public speaking. I think in a way that helped me and has continued to help me. But I would love to know again, probably in that quicker response, did any of y'all have any thoughts about whether being on the spectrum has contributed to your ability to be a public speaker or communicator?
I have a thought on this too.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, because I think the nice thing about when you have a large room full of people, even a virtual room, is you don't have to, it's not as cumbersome as a one-on-one interaction where you have to constantly be checking in and reading who you're talking to, is that you kind of have a captive audience that wants to listen to whatever you want to talk about, especially if it's one of your special interests. You are basically having an audience that is here for you, info dumping and being your full self. So in a sense, I think public speaking is a lot easier just because a lot of the normal social rules aren't always in play, that you're thinking, oh my God, I have to think about what they're feeling and thinking that you
It's not really interactive at all. They just listen. Yes.
That was my sense on it.
Yes and no, it is interactive. And I think a really good public speech does take your public into account. And let me start by saying this. I've never not been autistic, so I don't know what the alternative would be like for me. I do know what I see other people claim as difficulties that they have. And I know that the difficulty of immediately automatically thinking you understand what people mean or what people want is actually very helpful, because it makes you aware of the need to consider that in your story. And yes, there definitely is the part where being asked to step on stage and have dedicated time to tell the story of one of the things I find most interesting in the world. What is not to like about that for somebody on the spectrum? That's like, you're asking me to be myself and just tell you about it, and get you to become excited and interested in the things that light me up. So yeah, that's awesome.
What do you think, Zach?
So, I mean, public speaking has always been not my strong suit. I do all right at it now, but only after years of therapy and help. And so I think that, it's more of a social anxiety thing than anything. But nevertheless, I mean, has autism made my public speaking better? No, propranolol has. But that's beside the point. I think that, realistically, it is a thing that I have had to work extra hard on, but I can do it. It's just not benefiting from my autism per se.
So part of the factoring in here is that we're all individual people with some combination of other things in our personality. But I think that's an excellent point to bring to it. So possibly an autistic trait could make someone a better public speaker, but not necessarily. There are two more questions I have here, and because we have 3 minutes, I'm going to ask my panelists. If you have a response to this first one, I would love for you to type it in the chat, because you may not have one. But Noah would love to know, does anyone here have a diagnosis or symptoms of OCD? And if so, what impact has that had? So if you happen to have any experience or knowledge about OCD and its overlap with autism, whether it's personal or you have a friend or family member, feel free to put that in the chat for Noah. The last question I want to read out for our last couple of minutes is another direct message, so I'll keep it anonymous. But this person says that she's the mom of a 8-year-old girl, and that she doesn't share her diagnosis with anyone other than the therapists who need to know. So not even teachers, family, friends. And the mom says it's clear that her daughter is different from other kids, but doesn't want the diagnosis to be community gossip. And she would love to know how the panel feels about this. Is it wrong to hide that? And she says she's proud of her intelligent, interesting little girl, doesn't know what to do on this front. And then also wonders, is hiding the diagnosis now, does that give her daughter the choice later to disclose it or not disclose it? Yes. So if you guys have any input on that, or if there's something longer form that you would like to share that we don't have time for, feel free to email it to me, and I'll try to find this person and send them your response. But just because we have 1 minute left, and we may go over by about 5 minutes with our recording here, but a lot of people may have to log off. But what are your thoughts to this mother who's got an 8-year-old who she describes as wonderful, but also nobody really knows what it is that's different about her?
I was around the same age when I found out I was autistic. So I think that if she is in the know, then your daughter has every right to disclose if or when she wants to. I was certainly not open at that age. It came to me in my later teen years, and when I found community and when I felt more comfortable and after I got outed by a teacher, which is a whole other story. But as long as she has that understanding, and that's fine that she doesn't want to tell everyone else, and respect that decision.
I'm going to stick to whatever works. You know, it's part of diversity that people also learn to understand that different approaches are going to work for different people, and there will not be a universal a solution. But as long as you're respectful and mindful of people, then if you're, you know, whatever you do with the best of intentions and as informed as you can be, that's going to be the recommendation for your case, I think. Having said that, I do appreciate the notion that, you know, this is my child is my ward, and that's how I see myself, as the mother of 2 kids. They're my wards, for me to watch over until they become adults and masters of their own lives, and then they can choose to do whatever it is that they want to do with what information they have.
Absolutely. And I would advise this mother, I think I agree with the panelists who have said talking to your daughter does, I mean, she's at an age where she can say, she can have an opinion on this. I mean, 8 is young, but it's not too young to say, like, okay, here's who I am, here's how I relate to other people, and here's what I might want or not want them to know. We are living in a world that by the moment it becomes more neurodiversity friendly. So if your child does disclose now, or if you disclose now, like if that were to be the decision she made at 8 or 9 years old, you're not setting her up for inevitable failure. There will be spaces that are welcoming and celebratory of that fact. Will there continue to be spaces that aren't? Yeah. Likely so, which is unfortunate. But minute by minute in the work I do, I'm watching everybody get better at this, which I think it matters in this conversation, right? And the autistic community will always be welcoming of anyone who identifies as autistic, whether they're public with it or private. And I think the last thing I would add to this is, as you talk to her about it, be sure to say that hiding it has not been because it's a bad thing about her. Hiding it has just been so that other people didn't misunderstand it to be a bad thing. Because you want to give her a strong sense of self, that the way she was made is perfect, and not that there aren't supports that she may need her whole life, but that there's nothing inherently broken about her. So that is, again, the 2 cents unsolicited that you get from Claire today. But thank you so much to my 3 panelists. Special thanks to Haley for opening up our conversation today. These 3 are incredibly interesting and have had personal and professional experiences that I hope have sort of educated and made you guys think about new perspectives about autistic success in professional fields. So it's been a privilege to moderate this panel. The recording will be up on the Frist Center YouTube page. We'll put it up tomorrow afternoon. So if you just look up Frist Center for Autism and Innovation on YouTube, like, you will find it at some point after 2 or 3 p.m. tomorrow. You may also be interested in our past Autistics Roundtable webinar on international perceptions of autism. So I'd encourage you to check that out, especially if anything about Suzana's story about sort of being from Brazil and Rio. And so we had past panelists who talked about being from different countries. There are several other webinars on our website you may enjoy as well. And finally, I will say that we are on Instagram at Autism and Innovation, one word. So if you want to follow along and see future events as they're coming up, that is the best place to find out about them. But I am going to end this recording and log everybody off. Thanks again to everyone who participated today.